The year was 1923, and the town of Black Hollow lay buried under a thick blanket of snow. Located deep in the Rocky Mountains, the isolated settlement was known for its brutal winters, but none had ever seen anything like this. The snowstorm had raged for 5 days straight, cutting the town off from the rest of the world. The railroad tracks were buried, the telegraph lines were down, and the only road in or out of Black Hollow was impassable. The townsfolk, used to hardship, hunkered down and waited for the storm to pass. But as the days turned to nights, something began to stir in the cold. Among the townsfolk was a young widow named Clara Everwood. She lived on the outskirts of Black Hollow in a modest cabin she had inherited from her late husband. Clara was a seamstress, known for her skill with a needle and thread, and she spent her days repairing clothes for the townsfolk. But on the second night of the storm, Clara began to hear whispers. They came from outside, faint at first, almost drowned out by the howling wind. But as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Clara, help us. We're so cold." She dismissed it as her imagination, the result of loneliness and the storm playing tricks on her mind. But the whispers didn't stop. They persisted every night, growing more desperate, more insistent. By the fourth night, Clara was too afraid to sleep. She sat by the fire with her shotgun across her lap, her eyes darting to the windows, covered in frost. Elsewhere in town, similar tales began to emerge. People spoke of shadows moving in the snow, of voices calling their names. At first, they laughed it off as cabin fever, but the laughter died when young Jacob Carter, the baker's son, went missing. His parents claimed he had been lured outside by a voice calling for help. They found his footprints in the snow, leading away from their home, but they ended abruptly in the middle of the street. There was no sign of Jacob, no trace of where he had gone. Panic began to take hold of Black Hollow. Families huddled together, barricading their doors and windows. Reverend Whitaker, the town's preacher, urged everyone to pray for deliverance. But prayer did little to keep the fear at bay. Each night, more people reported hearing the whispers, and each morning, another resident was missing. The whispers weren't just a figment of their imagination, they were real, and they were hunting. Clara's breaking point came on the fifth night. The whispers had grown unbearably loud, echoing through her small cabin as if the voices were inside with her. Desperate and terrified, she decided to seek help. She bundled herself in layers of clothing, grabbed her lantern, and set out for the church in the heart of town. The storm had calmed slightly, but the air was bitterly cold, and the snow was waist-deep. Every step was a struggle, and the whispers followed her, swirling around her like a ghostly choir. "Clara, don't leave us. Stay with us." When she reached the church, she found Reverend Whitaker and a dozen townsfolk gathered inside. The church was dimly lit by candles, and the air was heavy with the scent of burning wax and fear. Clara told them about the whispers, about how they had grown louder and more menacing. She wasn't surprised to learn that everyone else had heard them too. "This is no ordinary storm," Reverend Whitaker said, his voice trembling. "This is a curse. We must have angered the Lord." "Or something else," Clara murmured, thinking of the old tales her grandmother used to tell. Stories of vengeful spirits and ancient evils that thrived in the cold. As the group debated what to do, the church doors suddenly flew open. A gust of icy wind extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers flooded in, louder than ever, their tone no longer pleading, but furious. "You cannot escape us." Panic erupted. People screamed and ran for the doors, only to find them frozen shut. Clara clutched her lantern, its flickering light barely cutting through the darkness. She felt a hand grab her arm and turned to see Reverend Whitaker, his face pale and resolute. "We must hold our ground," he said. "If we give in to fear, they will take us all." The whispers grew deafening, and shadows began to move in the darkness. They were shapeless at first, amorphous black forms that slithered along the walls. But as the light from Clara's lantern danced across them, they began to take shape. Human-like figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, their bodies emaciated and twisted. "The Cold Ones," Clara whispered, the name slipping from her lips unbidden. She didn't know where she had heard it before, but the words felt ancient, primal. The cold ones advanced, their movements slow but relentless. The townsfolk huddled together, their fear palpable. Reverend Whitaker began to pray aloud, his voice steady despite the chaos. Clara joined in, though her words felt hollow. She wasn't sure if prayer would save them, but it was better than doing nothing. Just as the cold ones reached the center of the church, the storm outside intensified. The wind howled like a living thing, and the temperature plummeted even further. Clara's breath froze in the air, and frost began to creep up the walls. The cold ones paused, their hollow eyes turning toward the windows. For a moment, Clara thought they might retreat, but then the largest of them stepped forward. It raised a skeletal hand and pointed at her. "You brought us here," it said, its voice a rasping echo. "You must pay the price." Clara's blood ran cold. She had no idea what the creature meant, but its words filled her with dread. Before she could react, the cold ones surged forward, their forms dissolving into a black mist that engulfed the room.